All right, so you're going to need your handout because we're going to go through that very quickly. And as we go through the handout, thank you. As we go through the handout, make sure you study in the following ways. We're going to go through all 5 infectious agents. I'm going to go through all 5 infectious agents: viruses, bacteria, fungal infections, protozoan infections, and then worm infestations. For each one, make a note to yourself, maybe somewhere on the handout. You must know what the organism is. For example, viruses. We're going to go through each of these organisms. And most of the information is on the handout. I'm going to be making comments and pointing things out, adding to what I gave you on the handout so that you can know a general idea of how infections work. So let's go back through viral very quickly. And for each organism, you need to know what it is. What is a virus? It's a subcellular parasite that invades a specific target cell type. It is, what happens with the virus is it actually attaches to a specific cell and injects that cell with its DNA. That's how viruses cause problems. And then they take over the cell's reproductive processes and make the cells start making hundreds and hundreds of little virus particles. Then that, of course, destroys the cell bursts and the viruses spread throughout. And then each one of those viruses attaches to the cell. And eventually it results in 2 modes of pathogenicity. What are they? Cell destruction and cellular transformation. That's why viral infections can trigger cancer later. Okay, cellular transformation, which is part of the progression of cancer. On each of these organisms, I want you to pay attention to what the organism is, okay, how it causes disease, the preventatives and the treatments, and then examples. Gave you lots of them on that handout so that you'll recognize a viral infection versus a bacterial infection, those are the main 2 disease-causing pathogen types, viruses and bacteria. Fungus can also be pathogenic. It's not as common. So viruses, what are they? How do they cause disease? What's the preventative? The preventative is vaccination. However, a second preventative that you can use probably on most of these infections is cleanliness. I told you earlier that the single most important thing to do to not get the flu this flu season is wash your hands. Okay? So stay away from small children also. That could be a good preventative. So we've got what is the organism? What is a virus? How does it cause problems? What is its mode of pathogenicity? Preventatives. Vaccinations. Most of your vaccinations are for viruses. Not all. There are some bacterial infections that release toxins. I told you about tetanus. Tetanus is not viral, but you do get you can get a vaccination against tetanus, but it's not against the organism, it's against the tetanus toxin. Then treatments. So we need to know what the organism is, how it causes disease, what are preventatives, what are treatments, and examples. We talked about treatments very briefly. Viruses do not respond to antibiotics. Why not? First of all, they're not cells, and antibiotics are designed to destroy cells. Secondly, they hide in their host cells. Antibiotics have no effect on viruses. All right, so your main treatment is allowing your own body's defenses to work with extra rest and fluids. There are some antiviral medications. Some of your body's own antiviral compounds can be mimicked. One of them is called interferon. It's an antiviral compound produced in your body, and they are able to kind of mimic it. But they're not antibiotics, they are antivirals, a whole different class of medications. Examples. Think about the vaccinations you received as a child. It's probably a viral infection. So we have some main viral infections. The first, of course, is the common cold. That is the rhinovirus. There's also a coronavirus. We're constantly identifying all these different strains of viruses. The German measles, also known as rubella. Hepatitis, you can get a hepatitis series, that's against hepatitis B, which is the more severe and chronic form of hepatitis. Measles, so for chicken pox, you don't get a vaccination for it. Why not? You can. They do have a vaccine for chicken pox, but chicken pox is a relatively minor disease, so you might as well just go ahead and have the disease and get better immunity than take a chance on a vaccination. Keep in mind, all medications, all medical procedures have risks and side effects. So you always balance benefit versus risk, okay? So then, if you look at your handout, we've got different, pick a couple that you recognize. Of course, your main ones, and the ones we will talk about, is the HIV virus. Of course, that stands for human immunodeficiency virus. You can see chickenpox, varicella zoster, Epstein-Barr. Those are some similar, those are just some very common viral infections. And then you'll notice number 4, the fact it's important that you know out of all of our infectious agents, viruses are the ones that can bring about cellular transformation because of their mode of pathogenicity. All right, so those are viral diseases. Then we have bacterial infections. Bacterial infections, we're going to go through this in the same order. What are bacteria? Bacterial infections. What are bacteria? Of course, bacteria are colonies of simple cells. Each cell is, if you say it's singular, it's bacterium, but bacteriums are never found in single cells very much. They live in colonies. There's going to be multiple cells there. So bacteria is actually a plural noun. Bacteria are colonies of simple cells. They have 3 shapes that are important for you to know. Bacteria are classified according to the cell overall shape of their cell. There are 3 shapes. Cocci, that is spelled C-O-C-C-I, cocci. These are little round balls that resemble a cluster of grapes. And this type of bacteria is rarely, if ever, found by itself. There'll just be clusters and clusters of little round grape-like looking cells. These are called cocci. And these 3 types of bacteria are used in their name. I mentioned, I think last time, strep throat is caused by a streptococci. Okay, so what is streptococci? It is a little round clusters of bacteria that cause strep throat. That's how it was even named. So cocci is the first shape. It's little round balls in grape-like clusters. Then you have bacilli. Okay, these are the plural. Coccus, US, is singular, I on the end is plural. Bacillus would be single, bacilli would be plural, B-A-C-I-L-L-I. And these are also employed in the organism's name. Okay, if you look, you can see Streptococcus pneumoniae causes pneumonia. Streptococcus pyogenes causes strep throat. Pyogenes literally means fire producer, so referring to fever. Then you have Staphylococcus aureus, Staphylococcus epidermidis, that's the acne one. It's causing inflammation of the epidermis of the skin. So all of these organisms are named by shape, and a lot of times by how they were discovered or how they play a role. So then the next type is bacillus. This one is not incorporated very much into the name except for the anthrax virus. Look about halfway through the list. Bacillus anthracis. That causes anthrax. Okay, so bacillus, these are rod-shaped, elongated, rod-shaped, and these are often free-moving. They won't be all clustered together like the cocci. The last shape is spiral. And these have very thin, ribbon spiraled shape. They're very thin and ribbon-like and in a spiral. Those are very dangerous type of bacteria. So bacteria are colonies of tiny, simple cells that exist in 3 basic shapes: cocci, bacilli, and spiral. Characteristics of bacteria. Bacteria are a different cell type than the cells that make up your body. There are 2 main categories of cells in biology: prokaryotic cells, which are very small and simple, and eukaryotic cells, which are 10 times bigger and make up your multicellular organisms, and some single cell as well. So bacteria are very simple. Evolutionists, of course, gave them the name prokaryotic, which means before nucleus, because they are so simple they don't have a distinct nucleus. All they have is DNA that just exists in their cytoplasm. So they are very small, simple cells. They're 10 times smaller than regular cells that make up multicellular organisms like your body. So then another thing about bacteria is they frequently have additional features that allow them to evade the immune system. Remember, before an organism can cause infection, it has to be there, it has to be present, but it also has to do what? Proliferate. So viruses have ways to escape the immune system and cause problems. So do many types of bacteria. Are all bacteria pathogens? The answer is no. The only way they can become a pathogen is if they are able to somehow escape the effects of the immune system. They have to be able to proliferate. I told you that bacteria was ubiquitous. It's part of your normal flora. It's part of the flora of your intestines. All right, but they're not all pathogens. So what happens is many pathogenic bacteria have extra features that allows them to evade the immune system. For example, there are bacteria that have a capsule. In addition to their cell structure and their cell membrane and their cell wall, they have an external capsule, which makes it very difficult for the white blood cells to attach to it and destroy it. For example, you have your pneumonia virus. The Streptococcus pneumoniae has a capsule. The Bacillus anthracis that causes anthrax has a capsule. So then the immune system has difficulty handling it. So it's able to proliferate and cause disease. There are other types of bacteria that have a slime layer that makes them literally slippery. So the immune system cannot destroy them. There are some that form spores. I may have heard of botulism. It's a foodborne illness caused by, often encountered with improperly canned foods. Okay, so that doesn't happen in the United States very, very rarely. But the Clostridium bacteria that causes that is able to form a spore. So it can survive the hydrochloric acid in your stomach. Okay? So it is a pathogen, a very severe pathogen. So most bacteria are not going to be able to get by your immune system. So our pathogens that we have on our list here all have additional mechanisms that give them an advantage over the immune system. They have a capsule, they have a slime layer, they can form spores. A spore is a very hard outer covering that the bacterium encases itself in, and then once it gets through the stomach into the more favorable environment of the small intestine, it's going to start causing disease. Others release toxins. Botulism does both. The Clostridium botulism organism forms a spore, and then once it gets out of the stomach and into the small intestine, then it can release toxins. So it is a very dangerous pathogen. Some bacteria also secrete digestive enzymes into their environment. What's that going to cause? Cell destruction. All right, and then there are little tiny hair-like projections called pili. Some bacteria have that, and it allows them to attach, for example, to the wall of your intestine and start colonizing and propagating and causing problems. So bacteria are colonies of tiny, simple cells in 3 shapes. Not all bacteria are pathogenic. Most of your pathogenic bacteria has to have an additional means or structure to evade the immune system. Then, route of infection. How do bacteria get in? They cannot penetrate intact skin, so the only way they can get in through the skin is through a cut or wound. One of the biggest problems with burn victims is that they die of an infection a few days later because their skin has been burnt and destroyed. So the skin is the first line of defense, as we talked about the other day. So they can't penetrate skin, so most of the time your bacterial infections are going to have to come from your respiratory tract, you inhaled it, or your digestive tract, you ate it. Okay, now there are some skin infections that are bacterial. Boils, you've probably heard of MRSA. That is a skin infection. Those are antibiotic-resistant staphylococcus, okay? Then, so most of our bacterial infections, if you look on our list of examples, most of those bacterial infections are, let me look at your sheet, are respiratory, and a lot of them are respiratory, and digestive. There are exceptions to the fact. You'll notice that leprosy is a bacterial infection of the skin. Lyme's disease, that is caused by a spirochete, a spiral-shaped bacteria. That requires an insect to transmit it. Those insects are called vectors when they carry disease and transmit it to a third organism. So we've got the route of infection. Most of the time it's going to be inhaled or eaten. Mode of pathogenicity. There are 4 modes of pathogenicity for bacteria in particular. The first is deprivation. That's one of the main modes of damage done by bacteria. The bacteria will deprive neighboring cells of oxygen and nutrients. They also actively destroy tissue where they are propagating. They, number 3, release toxins. A 4th one, that's not on our main list, is some bacteria can cause immune responses, over responses. What are those? Allergies, and so forth. So bacteria, what are they? How do they evade the immune system? How do they get in? How do they cause problems? Preventative. Number 1, preventative. Cleanliness. Cleanliness in food preparation and handling, and cleanliness with regard to sanitation. Okay, a lot of bacterial infections are due to poor sanitation. We're talking about poor sewage disposal, poor septic type setups, a lot of times in your third world countries. Or in your third world countries, the food handling is another problem. So bacterial infections are not as severe as viral, but they can be a nuisance, especially when traveling and so forth. Okay. So those foodborne illnesses are all going to be bacterial or fungal. You're not going to get a foodborne illness from a virus, okay? Where are you going to get a virus? Respiratory or blood, okay? So then your modes of pathogenicity: deprivation, destruction, release of toxins, but also can cause an over-response or an allergic reaction from the immune system. Preventative: cleanliness. That means both food handling and preparation, and sanitation, hand washing, cleanliness, but also proper disposal of sewage. Treatment: what is the main treatment of a bacterial infection? Antibiotics. And many times you will need an antibiotic to overcome a bacterial infection. With antibiotics, they should always be prescribed by a physician, and they should always be completed in their dosage. I told you for number 4, the fourth mode of pathogenicity, yes, we can have some immune response, but there are certain bacterial infections that are secondary to a first bacterial infection. Okay, how many have ever heard of scarlet fever? You can actually have heart valve damage from that, and that is a secondary strep infection. What happens is your immune system didn't completely destroy the Staphylococcus bacteria, and all it does is then float it around in your immune system. And this can cause damage to heart valves and joints, because these little, they're called immune antibody or antigen antibody complexes, and they get caught where your blood's flowing through. They get caught in little places. They get caught in the heart valve, cause problems there. They can get caught in the joints, cause problems there. So you should always take an antibiotic completely through, even if you feel better, and you should always have it prescribed by a physician, okay? Now, if you're in a third world country and you have no choices, obviously I'm not talking about that. But in the United States, you should never take an antibiotic that has not been prescribed for you, and you should always complete the dosage, okay? You're setting yourself up for problems if you take antibiotics indiscriminately. There are now, of course, there are 2 main antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria. MRSA, that's a staph infection, Staphylococcus aureus. It stands for I can't remember the name of the antibiotic. It starts with an M. So the M in the name is the antibiotic it's resistant to. I think it's methicillin. So it stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Okay, overuse of the penicillin type of antibiotics. Then the next one is VRE, vancomycin-resistant enterococci, I think is what that one is. There's another strain coming out too. I can't remember the name of it. It's very new, and it's causing problems in the medical profession. Overuse of antibiotics and antibacterials. So we're creating all these superbugs, they call them. Oh, that's an example of evolution. Not. They're still the same genus and species. They have adapted to their environment, however. But as soon as you remove the antibiotic, the bacteria does revert back to wild type. So it's not evolution. It's just a variant of the same organism. So that is the caution with antibiotics, though they are very important in handling bacterial infections. Okay, so we have those 2 by indiscriminate use. All right, treatment of antibiotics. And so most of your bacterial infections do respond to antibiotics. However, those that produce toxins, you will have to have an antitoxin, which is the problem with tetanus. Okay, so examples on your sheet. There are some bacteria that do cause skin infections. Staphylococcus aureus, Staphylococcus, the acne one. That one is a skin infection. Tetanus enters at the skin through a cut. Anthrax can directly attack the skin. That's why it's dangerous. Impetigo is not a fungal infection, it is bacterial. That's Streptococcus type A. Many, of course, if you want to think about them, enter through the respiratory tract. Leprosy actually can enter through the respiratory tract. Tuberculosis, or so-called TB, that is a bacterial infection. Strep throat is bacterial a bacterial infection. Meningitis. There are two types of meningitis, viral and bacterial, so you need a diagnosis on that one. Then we have respiratory. After respiratory, we also get food poisoning, where they enter through ingested food, salmonella, typhoid, cholera. Those are all bacterial infections. Bloodborne bacterial infections are typhus. Typhoid and typhus are two different organisms, two different infections. The bubonic plague, that of course was spread through infected what? Rats. Fleas on the rats. Not the rats, the fleas on the rats. And then the Lyme's disease is spread by a particular type of tick. So, what are bacteria? How do they get in? What's their mode of pathogenicity? How do they get in and escape? How do they get in and escape the immune system? What is their mode of pathogenicity? How can you prevent bacterial infections? And how are they treated? And some examples. There's lots of examples for you to choose from. Next, we have fungal infections. Fungal infections. Fungus is our third infectious agent. Fungus is a big umbrella category in biology. Fungus. It's a wide variety of plant-like organisms. Very wide variety. Yeast is a fungus. Ringworm is a fungus. Mushrooms are fungus. Okay? Be careful with mushrooms. They have the ability to release toxins, some of them. So you have to make sure you can identify which ones are poisonous or toxic and which ones are not. But so it's a very wide variety of plant-like organisms. Some of them are single-celled, some of them are multicellular. Your pathogens tend to be the single-celled fungal species. Okay? So fungus is a wide variety of plant-like organisms that includes yeasts, molds, and even mushrooms. Okay, their route of infection, how do they get in? How do they get in? All right, most of your fungal infections that you'll encounter are on the skin, so they don't have to get into the body per se. So many of them are skin infections. And in our case, most of them are more annoyance than they are deadly. Skin infections. We're talking about ringworm. It's not a worm. It's just a fungal species that likes to grow in a ring shape. That's the pattern of its growth. All of your toenail fungus and athlete's foot and all those type of things are your fungal infections. So their main way that they cause problem is on the skin, and they are going to deprive the neighboring cells and a little bit of cellular destruction. They're more of a nuisance on the skin. However, a second route of infection is respiratory. Fungi reproduce with spores, so you can inhale fungal spores. So fungus and mold can be a problem, and it becomes a problem when you inhale the spores. Okay, so then you can get lung infections. There are some very serious lung infections that due to the inhalation of spores. They are very uncommon and unheard of. So then, with our fungal infections, the preventative, there are two main preventatives for fungal infections. First, of course, would be cleanliness. A second is quarantine, isolation of infected persons. Now, we don't quarantine people with bacterial infections because a lot of them, there's too many bacterial infections. Everybody has them all the time. It's not practical. But fungal infections, to get rid of fungus, you have to isolate the person or at least cover the part of the body that is infected and so forth, because they are spread by contact. Skin-to-skin contact and locker room floor contact. Okay, so treatment. Antifungal drugs are needed for your fungal skin and toenail and fingernail type infections. They are very expensive. It's difficult to get rid of as far as your toenails and fingernails are concerned. And you can have that for years and years and years and years. Also, we can give antibiotics for internal fungal infections. Why? Those are cells, so antibiotics will work against cells. And they can't hide from the immune system like viruses can. So we also use antibiotics for some fungal infections. Examples, skin infections. Look at your sheet. These are, of course, when you think about a fungal infection, it should immediately bring to mind the preventative, cleanliness, right? And isolation or quarantine. So examples of your fungal infections, you can see on your handout. And on your handout, you can see the definition. Fungal are single or multicellular plant-like organisms, such as yeast, mold, and even mushrooms. And there's some organisms, and you can see thrust. That's a yeast infection, and that will be treated by antibiotics. And you've got athlete's foot, ring, all kinds of more disgusting diseases. And then your lung infections can be very serious. And those are on the bottom. Histoplasma. Those can be caused by inhaling spores. Organism number 4, protozoans. Protozoans. Protozoans are large, complex, single-celled organisms. They're large, more complex, single-celled organisms. They're more animal-like, in contrast to the fungal that are more plant-like. They're not plants, they're not animals, as far as how we classify them in biology. So protozoan are more animal-like. They're larger, more complex cells that are animal-like in that they're more complex, and they also are very modal. That means they are able to move on their own. The first protozoan that should come to your mind is the amoeba, the paramecia. Paramecia is not pathogenic. The amoeba is when it gets in your digestive system. So your protozoan infections. And then, as far as other countries, we have very serious tropical diseases that are caused by these organisms. Of course, this would be malaria is in this category. Notice it says these infections are typically serious tropical diseases spread by an insect vector. What is the vector of malaria? Everybody should know that. Mosquito, a very particular type of mosquitoes. The Anopheles mosquito. Well, we'll get there. So your protozoa infections are primarily blood-borne. They're going to require an insect bite. They can also be food-borne, as in the amoeba, ingested or drinking contaminated water. That's another thing you got to watch out for, water in tropical areas and less developed countries. So protozoans, more complex, single-celled, animal-like. I'm calling them animal-like because of their ability to move about. And they are primarily bloodborne, requiring the bite of an insect. That insect that is spreading the protozoan from animal to animal or animal to human is called a vector. It carries the organism and then injects it. So most of these are bloodborne, some foodborne. Mode of pathogenicity, cell and tissue destruction is the main one. The second one is massive immune response in the form of a high fever. Massive immune response in the form of a high fever. So the fever is caused by the immune system's response to the organism. Massive immune response in the form of a high fever. Preventative. Number one preventative is to avoid the vector. Insecticides, mosquito netting. Don't go out at dusk or other times when the vector is most active. Avoiding the vector is the key to preventing a lot of these protozoal infections. All right? And so we want to use insecticides to kill the vectors. We want to use mosquito netting. We want to stay inside when they're very active. So that's your main preventative of your protozoans. Treatment are highly toxic drugs to kill the vector, to kill the organism. Highly toxic drugs. And many of these diseases are very serious, if not fatal. A lot of that's due to the fever. So we have to have a highly toxic drug to eliminate the parasite. And it's even more of a parasite type thing than an infection. Examples of protozoan infections. These are the type of infections that if you go to places like Southeast Asia, places like Africa, places like South America, you may have trouble with these. The first example is amoebic dysentery. This is caused by the antamoeba histolytica. Histolytica, that word literally means cell burst. Lysis, cell lysis is when the cell bursts. Histo refers to cells. And so this is an amoeba that destroys the intestinal tract. It's ingested on contaminated food. You've got to watch out for what you eat and what you drink so you don't get a parasite. And these are able to colonize the intestinal walls and cause very severe symptoms. Of course, the first symptom is going to be dysentery, colitis, lesions to the colon, all kinds of serious lower digestive problems. Treatment, toxic drugs, and there are certain anti-parasitic drugs that are taken to try to get rid of the amoeba. And of course, there's going to be more than one. So it can be, a lot of times surgery is necessary to remove infected sections of the colon. So that can be very serious. So you need to watch out for this in unsanitary conditions, especially in the tropics and subtropics, where the infection rate is up to 80%. And people can actually carry this and be asymptomatic and spread it when they prepare food. Another protozoan infection. This is another serious one that you can encounter in the tropics and subtropics. African sleeping sickness. This is a severe form of meningitis, common to West Africa and East Africa. This is caused by the same organism. Of course, they identify it by where you can see African sleeping sickness. We have two different kinds there. And this also is bloodborne, similar to malaria, but it's spread by a fly called the tsetse fly. So it's bloodborne. And then a third disease we want to talk, well, this causes encephalitis. Okay, meningitis and encephalitis. Very high fever, headaches, paralysis, coma, and death. This one is very severe. Its treatment also involves very highly toxic drugs, trying to eliminate the protozoan. And this, of course, is often fatal. The third type, and this is malaria. I want to spend some time on malaria. Malaria is the leading cause of death worldwide. More people die of malaria than any other cause, including other infections, including heart disease, including cancer, including AIDS, including homicide, which is another problem. But anyway, malaria, this one I want you to know in more detail. It is probably the one that you will have problems with or have experience with if you go to the tropics or the subtropics. Malaria, first of all, is a protozoan infection caused not by a bacteria, not by a virus, but by a protozoan. This is a much larger, more complex cell. The species is called Plasmodia. Plasmodia. So we have various kinds. You can see we have Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium falciparum, Plasmodium malariae. Okay? So the general name of the organism is Plasmodium singular, Plasmodia plural. And the organism involved depends on how often the fever cycle starts and stops. All of them have the same vector. The vector is the Anopheles mosquito. You can see the vector there. It's not just any old mosquito. It's a particular species that is able to spread the protozoan from person to person or animal to person, whatever. It's caused by the insect's bite because the protozoan is in the saliva of the mosquito. So malaria is a very characteristic disease. As you can see, what I want you to know about malaria, I don't think I have it on there, but you'll need to write some things about it. Malaria is characterized by regular bouts of chills, fever, sweating, and then the cycle ends. And then it can, and we identify the species by how long the cycle lasts. A 48-hour fever, chills. So you get the chills, the fever, the sweats, and then the fever breaks, and then it starts over again. Bouts every 48 hours are the vivax species. Bouts every 72 hours are the malariae species, and then the 36 up to maybe 48 hours is the falciparum, and that is the most severe form of malaria, is from that species. So malaria is, that's what it is, and it's chronic. You can never really get rid of that protozoan, even though you can control the symptoms. Okay, recurring bouts of fever, chills, sweating, then it subsides. Then it comes back and recurs in cycles. Then you can get control of it, your immune system can get control of it, but you're going to be carrying that species, and you could have another bout 2 years later, another bout 3 years later, okay? And so you probably never will get rid of the organism, which means you don't want to get it in the first place. It's a chronic infection. Chronic means you always have it, it's there, it flares up, subsides, flares up. That's what the adjective chronic has to do with. So it's characterized by these regular bouts of fever, chills, sweating in cycles. And this is caused by the life cycle of the organism. Okay? Because, and this organism attacks your red blood cells. So a lot of times it'll result in anemia and other problems when it actively destroys your red blood cells. Of course, the fever comes from the immune system fighting it. And it is chronic. You'll have relapses years later. Preventative is control of the mosquito population. And there are vaccinations. There's all that controversy about DDT years and years ago, and how that insecticide was too harmful to the environment and so forth. And as a result, a lot of people died from the mosquito population going out of control. Treatment is famous. There's a famous treatment for malaria, history behind it. It's called quinine, Quinine, quinine. Okay, though now we are able to manufacture all these different copies of quinine, and so there's different forms of it, but it's all based on that discovery. So malaria, very serious. It can become chronic. It's only fatal if it progresses to a severe anemia and internal hemorrhage, because it is destroying your blood cells. It can also become localized in the liver and other organs that have rich blood supplies. Okay, so malaria. If you go to Africa, get the vaccinations, use the mosquito nets, stay out inside, go during non-raising season, and so forth. You have to pay attention to disease when you go places like that. All right, last, worms. Worms. Worms are large, see that word, veriform? Large veriform animals. Veriform means snake-like or worm-like. Okay? You know what worms are. They're typically flatworms or roundworms, not so much your segmented worms like your earthworm. They're flatworms and roundworms. And a worm infection is typically referred to as an infestation, because there's a wide variety, and they act more as a classic parasite. Okay, so it's an infestation because it's a parasite. These are multicellular, large, visible organisms. Route of infection, contaminated food primarily. There are a couple that can burrow in the skin. Mode of pathogenicity, deprivation is the main one. Because a lot of times these worms will take up residence in the digestive tract and will ingest what you digested for them. They'll deprive the entire host, not just single cells, but they'll deprive the entire host of nutrients. They also cause cell destruction and the immune response, the fever, and so forth. Preventative is sanitation and thorough cooking of meat, because these are parasites, and if the animal had the parasite and you eat the flesh of that animal, it will be transmitted to you. Preventative, sanitation, and thorough cooking. Not so much a problem in the United States because the FDA does a little bit of a good job inspecting meat, so things get by, but not compared to other places. So tapeworm, contaminated beef, pork, or fish. Sushi. We won't go to sushi. I don't like sushi. Anyway, beef and pork especially have tapeworms. And this type of infection is usually an infestation by a single worm in your digestive tract. And this one is less severe. Abdominal pain, nausea, weight loss, diarrhea, and so forth. Roundworm, trichinosis, is caused by a roundworm. This is contaminated pork. Okay. Then you can have what's called elephantitis, which is a inflammation and collection of fluid in the legs. The legs get full of fluid, and that's why it's called elephantitis. This is carried by a vector, mosquito bites, and these are little adult larvae. They get trapped in your lymph vessels, so your tissue fluids can't circulate, and so you have all this, it's called edema, swelling in your legs.